pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with my February wrap-up. Had a pretty good reading month, read some great books, and I only had 3 bales, so let's start with those. In chronological order, the first one, and I'm sorry to disappoint some people for whom this was a darling book, but it just wasn't for me. Sorry to Disrupt the Peace by Patty Yumi Cottrell. I hated the prose. I read the first chapter, I can't remember if it's in chapters, but I read the first chunk, not very, 10, 15 pages, and it made me want to puke. I just hated the writing style. So, glad other people loved it, but not for me. And sometimes I just have a strong emotional reaction to a novel's prose. I have to respect it. So, it doesn't happen that often. But next, I did bail on the Tayari Jones novel, An American Marriage. I read, I can't remember how much, 15 or 20%, and it was about a African-American couple. I can't remember exactly what decade, but maybe 1990s or the 2000s. It was pretty current, or maybe even the 2010s. And he is accused of rape, and he was falsely accused and convicted and went to prison. And I just couldn't get past the fact that what I was reading, was a bunch of letters back and forth between him and his wife. They were young, where they were processing in a really Harlequin romance way all the insipid bullshit that most couples have to process in a marriage, never mind when one's in prison, and especially never mind he was falsely imprisoned, and none of that ever came up in the conversation or in the correspondence. Now, again, lots of people love it. It wasn't working for me. And my final bail of February, only 3, was another, I believe, February new release, The Mermaid and Mrs Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower. The historical novel set, I believe, in the late 18th century, about a mermaid and Mr. Hancock, eventually Mrs. Hancock. And the writing was really good, but it was a Disney story. I quickly lost interest. Read 30%, listened to 30%. I did it on audio, and then the audiobook was narrated by the wonderful Juliet Stevenson, so that kept me going far longer than I probably would have in print. Lovely prose. Just fluff. So those were my bails. On to happier news, which for February I didn't have any 1-star or 2-star. So let me give you a quick reminder of how I evaluate books, because I've got some 3, 4, and 5 stars. For me, a 3-star book is one that I didn't like. A 4-star book is one that I liked but didn't love. A 4-star could also be a book that I loved but had such horrible flaws that I just had to knock off a star. And 5-star books are books that I loved, which may include books that had flaws that I didn't care about because I just loved it so much, okay? I only had one 3-star book in February, and that was Annie Proulx's Barkskins. I have a full review on this, which you can check out, so I'm not going to say too much, but I was quite disappointed with this. It was a book by one of my favorite writers. Her Proulx's novel, The Shipping News, is one of my favorite novels, and I just felt she bit off more than she could chew. Now, it was a sweeping historical novel about the decimation of the North American forest and the indigenous peoples who lived within those forests, or who lived in North America. It was split between 2 parallel sagas. One was one of the French-Canadian guys who married into the Micmac tribe, and the other was a guy who became a timber magnate, and their descendants on down. I found that the half of this novel that was about the Métis or mixed-race indigenous characters was much more emotionally satisfying, but not perfect. But that probably would have been a 4-star read if it had just been that story. But the other story of the Dukes, the Duquets, who later anglicized their name to Duke, was basically a data dump about the history of forestry in North America. I mean, I suppose I should care, but not really. And a bunch of sexual quirks attached to paper-thin characters in each generation, which was supposed to flesh out the narrative. No. But parts of it I liked, so 3 stars. I had 3 4-star reads. So again, a 4-star read for me is a book that I liked but didn't love. The first one was Fire Sermon by Jamie Quatcho, and I have a separate review. Please check it out if you're interested in this book, because I put quite a lot of passion into expressing my views on it, so I'm not going to regurgitate much of that, but I felt that this novel captured marital life in modern America in such a lush, uncliched way that it broke new ground. But then the woman goes and has an extramarital affair, and that part of, which was the central part of the story, was boring, not well written, and not nearly as interesting as her married life. And I'm not speaking in any socially conservative way. I'm just saying what sang in this novel was what the protagonist wanted to leave. What she was grasping towards was dull and not well written. I have many more thoughts. Please check those out. This one I don't have a separate review on, so I'll talk a little longer, and that is a book of poetry. This is the only book of poetry I read in February, and I was moved to try it because Eric raved about this gay African-American poet's newest book of poetry. His name is Danez Smith, and his 2017 collection is called Don't Call Us Dead. That was not available to me on Scribd, which is my go-to place for ebooks or audiobooks, but his earlier collection from 2015 was available through that subscription service, and that book of poetry is called Black Movie. I really enjoyed it. This was a 4-star read. I didn't get all of the poems. Danez Smith in this collection wrote poems that were based on his kind of send-up or take-off on movies, TV shows, and reality TV shows, most of which, because I'm so obtuse about popular culture, I had no idea what he was talking about. I shouldn't say most of them, but many of them. So those ones left me a bit cold, but that's just because I'm an old fart. But many of them, too, had an incredible power about racial injustice in modern America, whether it be police shootings or whatever. And a few of them, not as many as I was expecting, were about gay sexuality. 2 of the poems that were about being black in modern day America I thought were really powerful. One was The Politics of Elegy, and the other, which I think was the best in the book, was called Dear White America. Now some of these poems, or some poems from this collection, are available on YouTube, and I think more than most poets, Danez Smith is somebody who you should watch and listen to, not just read on the page. But even though I read those poems that I just mentioned, I read on the page, they were incredibly powerful. But yeah, I couldn't really get into his poetry on the page until I watched a few of his poems on YouTube, so check him out that way. I'm going to read you an excerpt from a long poem called Short Film. This is section 7, and this section is called Hand Me Down. All my uncles are veterans of the war, but most of them just call it blackness. All their music sounds like gospel from a gun's mouth. I gather the blues must be named after the last bit of flame licking what used to be a pew or a girl. I wish our skin didn't come with causalities. I can't imagine a sidewalk without blood. When the men went off to fight each other, the women stood in the kitchen making dinner for white folks. No one said the kitchen was theirs. No one said their children didn't thin, then disappear altogether. Not all the women worked keeping someone else's house in order. My great-grandmother owned her block, a shop where she sold fatback and taffy, ran numbers. I imagine that little stretch of St. Louis as a kingdom, a church, a safe house, made of oxtails and pork rinds, a place to be black and not dead. Eventually, all black people die. I believe when a person dies, the black lives on. I find that incredibly stunning. So, Danez Smith, my first but not my last exposure to his poetry. Can't wait to get to his newer one that Eric has raved about, Don't Call Us Dead. And Eric actually has a funny anecdote about it. If I can find it, I'll put a link in the show notes to his awkward author encounter with Danez Smith. Having watched Danez Smith on video since I saw Eric's awkward encounter anecdote, I think probably Danez Smith was not so fussed about anything that Eric might have said to him, but it's a wonderful anecdote. My last 4-star read of February was the 2017 novel Refuge by Dina Nayeri. I have a full review of this. Please check it out for further information. But this was a fascinating novel by an Iranian-American novelist. I believe it's her second novel. It's a heavily autobiographical novel about an Iranian girl who goes into exile at the age of 8 with her Christian mother and her brother, leaving her atheistic Muslim dentist, opium addict father back in Iran. And over the next 2 decades, she only sees her dad 4 times. And eventually she grows up in America and then Europe, and she marries a French guy, and they live in Amsterdam, and she struggles to kind of piece all the aspects of her identity together. And she's kind of a bland character, so that was one of the flaws for me. But the father, Bahman, back in Iran, was one of the most fascinating characters in anything I've read recently. He made the novel so interesting. One of the things I didn't like about the novel was that we didn't dip into his consciousness, his point of view, often enough, especially during the extended scenes of those 4 reunions with the family. And that was a drag on the energy of the novel, I thought. But the writing is really great, and I think Dina Nayeri has a genius sense of how to create a scene in a novel, and a lot of writers don't. I thought the writing was really great. The characters were fully developed, but there was something that didn't hang together. So this, to me, was not a masterpiece, but Dina Nayeri has one in her. Please check out my review if you want to hear more. Last, I have 3 5-star reads to tell you about. The first one is Maggie O'Farrell's memoir, I Am, 17 Brushes with Death. I did this one on audio, and I thought it was just wonderful. The only other book I've read by her is her novel, The Vanishing Act of Esme Lennox. I read it last fall, loved it. And this is her memoir about just what it says, 17 Brushes with Death. I thought it was really powerfully written, and I don't really get along well with memoir for the most part, but the way that she patterned it based on those 17 experiences that were kind of standalone, but with some great observations on how it affected her mortality and her parenting and her relationship with her husband, and was done in a way that really worked for me. Believe the hype. This memoir is fantastic. The next one, I finally finished this book, which was the first book that I started reading on New Year's Day this year. So I did this one in a savory way. I took my sweet time. The Czar of Love and Techno by Anthony Marra. Anthony Marra's debut novel, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena. It's the second most favorite novel of my entire reading life. So I was so delighted to start this. This is a collection of linked short stories, and this was a 5-star read, but I didn't love it as much as I loved A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, but it's still in the 5-star range. This is set also in Chechnya and Russia. Anthony Marra, as far as I know, has no biographical connection to the region, but boy, his muse is there. I thought these linked short stories were brilliant and not as emotionally compelling all the way through as the novel had been, but there were stories and characters and parts of it that really ripped my heart out as well. Just gorgeous writing. Unlike A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, I felt that this collection of short stories was not one that was particularly meant to be read alongside a bunch of other books, so I am going to reread it before I try to say too much more, because I think I missed parts of it, but I got enough to know that it's brilliant, and I recommend it in a 5-star way. But if you only read one book by Anthony Marra, it should be A Constellation of Vital Phenomena. And the last 5-star read, and the top read of February, and I predict one of my top reads of 2018, was Freshwater by Akweke Emeze, a Nigerian Igbo Tamil writer. So she's mixed race. Her father was Nigerian and her mother was Tamil Malaysian. But she grew up in Nigeria, and this is her very autobiographical novel about such a woman as she, mixed race, growing up in Nigeria and being an Igbo deity uncomfortably incarnated in the body of this young girl, and eventually going on to what we in the West would term to be dissociative identity disorder. This is one of the best and most inventive debut novels I've read in forever, and primarily because of the inventive, really bizarre, wonderful narrative strategy through which Emeze tells the story. Most of the novel is told with a royal we, or a godly we, an undifferentiated mass of Igbo deities who are narrating the story and referring to the protagonist, Ada, as the Ada. and eventually multiple personalities develop and they have their own narrative voice. You don't have to believe in any of the spirituality stuff. You can take a psychiatric stance. You can reserve judgment on any of that stuff and just enjoy the tour de force that this novel is in terms of how it's structured and how the story is told. Let me quote from the review I just put up on Goodreads today. And I do have a separate review on YouTube. But I concluded my Goodreads review by saying, "Who knew the novel form was porous enough, could be stretched enough, for such a story to roar through its gates?" Enough said. So I've had a great reading month. It wasn't that's a big month quantity-wise, but quality-wise, I couldn't be happier. So thanks for watching.